Hey, so if you've been following along in the videos, this is the IBM Middleware Configuration for WebSphere Application Server plugin for IBM Urban Code Deploy. So now we've auto-discovered and auto-configured our environment. We've also talked about setting that up and ways to troubleshoot it if it doesn't work. But now it's time to actually do something with it. I want to import my environments. I want my WebSphere environment to be inside deploy. So the way to do that is that I need to create two components. I have a deployment manager scope that I want to add, and I have a server scope that I want to add. Now, since each component is particular to a specific scope, because the component is a data representation of what is out there in my WebSphere scope. Just like if you were to create a JDBC and you put it at the server scope, it'll only work for the applications at that server scope. Well, the component is for if I make a deployment manager component and I add it to the deployment manager scope here, then I'm only going to have data in that component representative of my deployment manager. So the first thing I need to do is go and create two components. I want a DMGR component, and I want to make sure I add the middleware configuration WebSphere template. Now this template gets generated when you install the plugin. And then I want to hit save. I also want to generate another component. I want to generate my server 1 component. And I want to also add the middleware configuration for WebSphere template. So normally when you create a component, you'd come in here and you'd create a process for a component. But I don't need to do that because my components have the McWAS template, which brings in these three processes that are already created. You don't want to edit these processes, and you don't ever want to change them. You just leave them the way that they are. So now that I have two components that already have processes for them, I can go back to my resource and I can say, okay, my deployment manager, I'm going to add my component, my DMGR. I can see it there, and I'm going to go ahead and add my server component as well. Now that I've got components that represent data for each scope within my resource, I need to bring it all together. I need to create an application, and I need to create an environment under that application. So I'm going to create a new application, and I'm going to call it WebSphere 8. I'm going to hit save. I'm then going to create an environment called WebSphere prod and hit save. And I'm going to create one called WebSphere QA and hit save. Now, I can make application processes, but if I go to my processes and I create a process, I want to import, right? I want to import my environment. So I'm going to call the process import. I'll hit save. Now, if I go to import, I can't, I don't know what steps here I'm supposed to add, right? There's nothing in this component process that resembles my server or deployment manager or anything WebSphere related. That's because I have to go to my application and I have to actually add the components. So once I add the component, it's going to add the component and add the component processes that are associated with that component. So now that I've added them, I can come back to my processes, click on import, and now I see the DMGR and server 1. Now, as stated down here, the only components with operational processes which do not require versions will appear. So even though there are three processes tied to this component, because I added the template, I only see one because this is the only one that doesn't require a version. Because there are no versions yet, right? I haven't imported any data for there to be a version. So here I'm going to put import DMGR, and I'm going to hit save. I'm also going to click generate server 1. I'm going to do the same thing, import server 1. Now it's important to note, don't touch any of these values. Don't click set value here or any of that, because when you run the action, you're actually going to set those values. If you set those values here, it won't give you the option to set them when you run it, which is very important because there's no auto increment for version. So we'll get into that in a second, but you just want to leave these the way that they are. Hit save. Then we're actually going to draw our map and hit save. Now that we have an application process and an environment, I need to add my WebSphere environment to my application. And I do that by adding a base resource. So my base resource is my WebSphere 8 environment. So I'll click OK. So as a recap, I have an application called WebSphere 8, which is my WebSphere environment. I have a production and a QA. So I added the components for my DMGR and my server. Now if I go to my WebSphere QA, I have this environment. And my components have been added to their appropriate scopes. Now I could have added the components here instead of at the resource level where I did, but it's just kind of up to you how you want to do that. So now that I've done that, I'm ready to actually run my project. I can actually run this and create my components and create my data within deploy. So if I want to run it from here, I click there, and so I can do import. This is my import process. Now see what I mentioned earlier, don't set the values when we were doing the application process. That's because I want to set them here. These don't auto increment. So if I run this once, I've already made component version 1. And if I go to run it again, it's still going to say 1 here. But if I try to run that version exists already and it'll fail. So you have to auto increment yourself. So I'm going to start off with 1 because this is the first time I'm doing it. So I'll hit submit. And now I'll watch these executions run as they expand. And there's no threading in WebSphere or in deploy for WebSphere with this plugin, right? So I can't run import DMGR and import server at the same time. They have to be done sequentially. And that's pretty much it. We're going to import our entire environment, and then that's about it. Now that my process is finished, as you can see here, success all the way down, let's talk kind of about what happened. So we acquired the lock, we generated the template, we created our version, which gets associated with all of the data from our template. And this is just our a template log that can be seen in the var directory on the target system for the agent. So let's go ahead and look at the generate template. This is the output log. This tells us everything that happens. Setting up our environment variables, connecting to the deployment manager with the ID, starting at that. We see the network connection's been made, the build file. If an error occurs, it tells us where to look. We see WAS common configuration. It runs down, and we see call wsadmin script. So now that we see that we're running an actual wsadmin script, it's connecting to the process, etc., etc. So if you know about wsadmin, you know there's a wsadmin.traceout, and the log is overwritten per action that happens with wsadmin. So it's always a great place to look for any kind of errors. That goes for as well as when you're auto-discovering and auto-configuring your environment. The wsadmin.traceout's a great log to look at too. So all of this happens. So this is our main log. The next one is the view output properties. These are the properties that are being outputted. These are always real good. This is all good information for when a property is not there or a value is not there that you see in the log, and you want to come here to check to see if it was passed, or if you've made it, or if maybe you forgot to create it in the environment properties, or whatever the case might be. And then this is just the red one is just your error log. 1 meaning success because it's Ant that's running these tasks. So you can see here my import DMGR, import server. So now I've got data. So how I check that data is I go to my components, I can click on the DMGR, I can click on versions, and I have version 1. If I click on version 1, here is all my data from my deployment manager. I have all these configuration files from my deployment manager. And so now I have a component called DMGR that represents all the data contained in my WebSphere cell from my deployment manager. Same goes for my server. I've got that too from my server as well. I go to versions and I check this. Because now let's say I go to my WebSphere environment and I make a bunch of changes. Now, if I wanted to read those changes in, I would do the same process as before by running it, except for this time, see how it does 1, I said you have to auto increment? Here I would put 2. And I would put 2 here. And now all those changes would be read in component 2. And I'd have 2 components. The first component would be the representation of my data now, and the second component would be the representation of my data after all the changes. So it's the exact same component that's being used, just different versions of that component hold different information based on what's changed or what's different. And if nothing has, then the components would be, component version 1 and 2 would be the same.